Welcome to a story like no other, a tale of betrayal, deception, and the kind of revenge that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust and justice. This is not for the faint-hearted. It's for those bold enough to explore the darkest corners of human nature. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a journey through heartbreak, power, and retribution. Imagine waking up one day to find your world crumbling, shattered by the people you trusted most. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a devastating blow that reached deep into your soul. What would you do if the one you loved betrayed you with someone sworn to uphold the law, someone with secrets far darker than you could imagine? In this gripping tale, we'll uncover how one man turned his despair into determination, his heartbreak into a calculated quest for justice. But revenge isn't simple, and every action comes with consequences. As secrets unravel and truths come to light, you'll find yourself asking, how far is too far when justice is personal? Stay with us as we dive into a story that will leave you on the edge of your seat, questioning every motive, every move, and every outcome. The warm glow of the morning sun seeped through the curtains, casting a golden hue over the neatly arranged kitchen. Daniel Keller's life, much like his surroundings, seemed perfectly in order. A man of discipline and habits, Daniel valued the little rituals that anchored his day, like savoring the first sip of freshly brewed coffee while scanning the headlines of the morning paper. To anyone observing from the outside, his life appeared enviable. At 37, he was a self-made success, running a lucrative real estate business that bore his name, living in a sprawling suburban home, and married to Emma, his college sweetheart. Emma was everything Daniel admired in a person: kind, poised, and effortlessly charismatic. Over the 10 years of their marriage, her radiant smile had been a constant source of joy for him, even during the toughest times. She was the woman who had stood by his side when his business struggled to take off, the woman who had celebrated every hard-earned victory with him. To Daniel, she wasn't just his wife, she was his sanctuary, his confidant, and the foundation of the life they had built together. But if there was one lesson life had taught Daniel, it was that appearances could be deceiving. Looking back, the signs had been there, faint yet unmistakable. Emma, who once seemed to hang on to his every word, now seemed distant during their conversations, her attention wandering to the phone she rarely put down. Her laughter, once genuine and warm, had become forced, almost rehearsed. She had started spending more time out of the house, claiming commitments to her volunteer work at a local community center. Daniel, ever trusting, chalked it up to a phase, a passing shift in the tides of their relationship. He convinced himself there was nothing to worry about, despite the growing knot in his stomach. It was an ordinary Thursday when everything changed. Daniel had left the house early, his briefcase in hand, heading to a high-stakes meeting with a potential investor. Halfway through his drive, he realized he had left an important document behind, a folder containing the financial projections he needed to seal the deal. Cursing his forgetfulness, he turned the car around and drove back home, mentally rehearsing his pitch as he pulled into the driveway. The house was unusually quiet when he entered, the kind of silence that felt out of place. As he moved toward his home office to retrieve the file, a muffled laugh stopped him in his tracks. It was Emma's laugh, but it carried a tone he hadn't heard in years, light, playful, and intimate. Daniel's brow furrowed as he followed the sound, his footsteps soft against the polished wooden floor. What he saw in the living room would haunt him for the rest of his life. Emma was entwined in the arms of another man, their bodies pressed together in a way that left no doubt about their intentions. The man, dressed in a sharp police uniform, exuded an air of authority and arrogance. Daniel's mind struggled to process the scene in front of him, his chest tightening as a wave of disbelief and rage washed over him. "Daniel?" Emma gasped, her face draining of color as she stepped away from the man. Her voice trembled, but she didn't move toward him, as if the distance between them had become insurmountable. The man, unbothered, adjusted his belt and turned to face Daniel with a smirk that made his blood boil. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said, his tone dripping with nonchalance. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of fury and heartbreak. "Mark Hansen," the officer replied casually, his smirk never faltering. "And I think you should leave." The audacity of his words sent a surge of anger through Daniel, but before he could respond, Emma stepped in, her voice trembling with desperation. "Daniel, please?" But Daniel didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned on his heel and walked out, slamming the door behind him. His heart pounded in his chest as he drove away, his vision blurred by the tears he refused to let fall. In the days that followed, the betrayal became public knowledge. The small-town grapevine ensured that everyone knew about Emma's affair with Mark, a well-known figure in the local police force. Mark, with his charming demeanor and clean-cut image, had long been a divisive figure, admired by some and despised by others. The whispers and sideways glances that followed Daniel wherever he went felt like daggers, each one a painful reminder of his humiliation. Emma moved out within a week, taking only her personal belongings. She left a note on the kitchen counter, citing irreconcilable differences as her reason for leaving. But Daniel didn't need her words to know the truth. She had chosen Mark over him, abandoning their decade-long marriage for a man who seemed to thrive on his authority and his ability to manipulate those around him. The betrayal seeped into every aspect of Daniel's life. His work, once a source of pride and purpose, became a battleground for his emotions. He struggled to focus during meetings, his mind constantly replaying the moment he walked in on Emma and Mark. Clients noticed his distracted demeanor, and deals began to fall through. The financial strain mounted, adding yet another layer to his despair. At night, the silence of the empty house was deafening. Daniel would sit in the darkness, his thoughts racing as he tried to make sense of what had happened. He combed through every memory of their marriage, searching for the moment when everything had gone wrong. The pain was relentless, a gnawing ache that refused to subside. But as the days turned into weeks, something within Daniel began to shift. The sorrow that had consumed him started to give way to anger, raw, burning anger. It wasn't just about Emma's betrayal, it was about Mark's arrogance, his audacity to flaunt his affair as if he were untouchable. Daniel realized that he couldn't let them walk away unscathed. He couldn't let Mark hide behind his badge, nor let Emma rewrite their history to suit her narrative. Sitting in the dim glow of his study, Daniel began to formulate a plan. It wasn't fully formed, but the pieces were starting to come together. This wasn't about vengeance for vengeance's sake. It was about reclaiming his life, his dignity, and his sense of justice. As he stared out the window at the moonlit streets, Daniel felt a newfound resolve take root within him. His fall had been devastating, but it wasn't the end of his story. It was merely the beginning. Mark and Emma had no idea what was coming. The days that followed were a blur of anguish for Daniel. The once thriving man, whose confidence could light up a room, now existed in a state of emotional numbness. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the storm that raged within him. The betrayal was a wound that festered, not only because of Emma's affair but because of the public nature of it. In their small town everyone knew. Every sideways glance, every hushed conversation, was a reminder that Daniel was the man who had been left behind. He retreated into himself, spending hours in the confines of his once lively home, now a hollow shell. The kitchen table where they had shared meals was now a graveyard of unopened mail and forgotten coffee mugs. The bed they once shared felt foreign, its emptiness a stark reminder of his new reality. His work, the lifeline that had once given him purpose, began to slip through his fingers. Clients noticed his distracted demeanor, the missed deadlines, the lackluster pitches. Deals fell apart. His business partner, Peter, tried to offer support, but Daniel's responses were clipped and mechanical. He wasn't ready to talk. The nights were the worst. Alone in the darkness, Daniel wrestled with memories of Emma. He replayed the moment he caught her with Mark Hansen, the smirk on the officer's face burning into his mind like a brand. The betrayal replayed in his mind over and over until he could barely breathe under the weight of it. For weeks, Daniel existed in this liminal state, hovering between despair and inertia. He canceled plans with friends, ignored calls, and stopped attending social events altogether. People tried to reach out, but their concern only deepened his sense of humiliation. What could they possibly say? No one could understand the depth of his pain or the crushing weight of betrayal. Then one evening, as he sat in the dim light of his study nursing a glass of whiskey, Daniel's eyes fell on the box Emma had left behind. It was a small cardboard box she'd packed hastily, filled with trinkets she no longer cared about. For weeks, he had ignored it, unwilling to confront the memories it held. But tonight something was different. Driven by a mix of anger and curiosity, he opened it. Inside, among the meaningless clutter, was Emma's old journal. Daniel hesitated, the ethical line of reading someone else's private thoughts flashing in his mind. But that line blurred quickly under the weight of everything she'd done to him. He flipped through the pages, his heart pounding as he read her entries. At first, they were harmless, recounting mundane events and feelings. But then the tone shifted. The name Mark Hansen appeared, first in passing and then with increasing frequency. The entries revealed more than Daniel had bargained for. Mark hadn't just been a casual fling, he had manipulated Emma from the start. The journal detailed how Mark had preyed on Emma's insecurities, feeding her doubts about their marriage and painting himself as the man who could give her what she thought she was missing. But what struck Daniel the hardest were the later entries. Emma had begun to doubt Mark, questioning his motives and his character. She described moments where he had been controlling, even intimidating. One entry stood out. Mark says his badge makes him untouchable, but sometimes I feel like it's a shield he hides behind. There are things he doesn't want me to know, things he's done that I don't want to ask about. Sometimes I wonder if I've made a terrible mistake. Daniel's hands trembled as he read the words. Emma's betrayal still cut deep, but now, a new emotion began to rise within him, curiosity. What secrets was Mark hiding? And could those secrets be the key to reclaiming his dignity and bringing Mark down? The discovery of Emma's journal became a turning point for Daniel. It was the first piece of the puzzle, the first thread he could pull to unravel Mark Hansen's carefully constructed facade. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. A week later, Daniel sat in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town, nursing a cup of bitter coffee. Across from him sat a man named Jake Reynolds, an old friend and a former private investigator. Jake had left the profession years ago after a messy divorce, but his skills were still sharp, and his moral compass was flexible enough to take on Daniel's request. "You're sure about this?" Jake asked, his piercing gaze studying Daniel's face. "Once we start digging, there's no turning back. You might find things you don't want to know." Daniel met his gaze, his jaw set with determination. "I need to know. I need to expose him for what he is." Jake nodded, sliding a notepad across the table. "Tell me everything you know about Hansen. Any detail, no matter how small." As Daniel recounted what he'd learned from Emma's journal, a plan began to take shape. Jake would start by digging into Mark's professional record, looking for complaints, disciplinary actions, or any whispers of corruption. Meanwhile, Daniel would begin to rebuild his strength, physically, mentally, and emotionally. If he was going to face Mark Hansen, he needed to be at his best. For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a sense of purpose. The pain and humiliation that had consumed him began to transform into something else: resolve. He started going to the gym, channeling his anger into every rep, every punch at the heavy bag. He revisited his work, slowly regaining the focus and determination that had once made him a success. As the days turned into weeks, Jake began to uncover pieces of the puzzle. Mark's record, while clean on the surface, was littered with whispers of misconduct, complaints that had mysteriously disappeared, cases where evidence had gone missing, and rumors of connections to unsavory figures in the community. One night, Jake called Daniel with a breakthrough. "You're not going to believe this," he said, his voice tense with excitement. "Hansen's been moonlighting, off the record. There's a lot of cash flowing his way that doesn't add up. I think he's involved in something big and it's not legal." Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. "How do we prove it?" "We dig deeper," Jake replied. "And when the time comes, we hit him where it hurts the most." As Daniel hung up the phone, a grim smile played on his lips. The pieces were falling into place. Mark Hansen had built his power on a foundation of lies and corruption, and Daniel was about to tear it all down. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. It was about taking back control of his life. And for the first time since his world had fallen apart, Daniel felt alive. Weeks passed, and the pain Daniel had endured began to take a new form. It was no longer an all-encompassing despair but a driving force, a seething determination that pushed him forward. Each step in his investigation into Mark Hansen felt like reclaiming a piece of himself. But the path wasn't straightforward. Jake Reynolds, his trusted ally, had become the linchpin in his quest for the truth. Jake wasn't just a private investigator, he was someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and claw his way back. Late-night calls and meetings in shadowy diners became their new normal. Jake had connections, and those connections were beginning to paint a damning picture of Mark Hansen. "He's dirty," Jake confirmed one night, sliding a thick manila folder across the table. The diner's fluorescent lights glared off its surface. Hansen's got his hands in a lot of pies. Illegal ones? Daniel opened the folder, his eyes scanning the contents. Photos, financial records, and confidential reports laid bare the truth. Mark Hansen wasn't just a crooked cop, he was a dangerous man, deeply embedded in a network of corruption. There were allegations of extortion, bribes from local businesses, and even ties to organized crime. One particularly damning piece of evidence was a series of wire transfers to a shell company linked to Hansen, each one coinciding with the sudden disappearance of key evidence in major cases. "Here's the kicker," Jake said, leaning back in his chair. "Remember those missing pieces of evidence? Turns out Hansen's been running a little side business, selling off confiscated items to the highest bidder. Drugs, weapons, even classified information. It's all in here." Daniel felt a cold fury rise within him. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. Mark wasn't just the man who had destroyed his marriage, he was a criminal masquerading as a protector. And now Daniel had the proof to bring him down. But there was more. As Jake continued his digging, he uncovered details that added a deeply personal twist to the story. Emma wasn't just an unwitting pawn in Mark's game. She had been targeted. In one of her journal entries, Emma had written about a chance meeting with Mark at a charity event. But Jake's investigation revealed that the meeting was no coincidence. Mark had been there with a purpose, using his charm to manipulate Emma into trusting him. It was calculated, premeditated. Daniel's anger deepened as he realized the extent of Mark's machinations. His wife, flawed though she was, had been preyed upon by a man who used power as a weapon. And while her choices were her own, Mark had exploited her vulnerabilities, driving a wedge into Daniel's life with surgical precision. Through Jake's network, Daniel found another unexpected ally. Sarah, a former police officer who had worked with Mark. She had left the force under mysterious circumstances, and Jake suspected her departure was tied to Mark. Sarah was hesitant at first, wary of getting involved. But when Daniel presented the evidence they had gathered, she agreed to help. "I've seen what Hansen's capable of," she admitted, her voice low. "He's untouchable because no one's willing to stand up to him. But if you're serious about taking him down, I'll do what I can." Sarah became an invaluable resource, providing insider knowledge about the police department's inner workings and helping Daniel understand how to leverage the evidence they had collected. Together they began to form a plan, a way to expose Mark's corruption to the world. But as their investigation deepened, so did the risks. Jake warned Daniel to be careful. "Guys like Hansen don't play fair. If he catches wind of what we're doing, he won't hesitate to retaliate." Daniel nodded, his resolve unwavering. "I'm not backing down." The first crack in Mark's facade came when they uncovered a whistleblower, a young officer named Ethan who had filed a complaint against Mark years ago. The complaint had been buried, but Jake managed to track Ethan down. Ethan was reluctant to talk, visibly shaken as he recounted his experiences. "He's untouchable," he said, his voice trembling. "Everyone who goes against him ends up paying the price. Careers ruined, families threatened. It's not worth it." Daniel leaned forward, his voice steady. "It's worth it to me. I've already lost everything because of him. But if we work together, we can stop him from doing this to anyone else." It took time, but eventually Ethan agreed to share his story. His testimony, combined with the evidence Jake and Sarah had collected, painted a damning picture of Mark Hansen, a man who used his badge not to serve and protect but to manipulate and destroy. The revelations weren't just about exposing Mark's crimes, they were about reclaiming power. For the first time since his life had fallen apart, Daniel felt like he was in control. The anger and shame that had consumed him began to give way to something stronger, a sense of purpose. He also began to see Emma's betrayal in a new light. While her choices were her own, Daniel understood that she had been a victim of Mark's manipulation. The man who had stolen his wife wasn't just a homewrecker, he was a predator. As they prepared to take the next steps, Daniel couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. The man who had once been consumed by despair was now a force to be reckoned with. His journey was far from over, but for the first time he felt like he was winning. The stage was set. The players were in place. And Daniel was ready to take back what was his. The air crackled with tension as Daniel sat in his home office, surrounded by piles of evidence, notes, and diagrams. What had once been a space for closing real estate deals was now a war room, every inch of the desk and walls covered with the details of Mark Hansen's life. Photos, timelines, financial records, and testimonies were meticulously arranged, each piece of information a weapon in his arsenal. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was a mission. The plan was complex, but Daniel had learned to embrace the intricacies. Every step needed to be flawless because Mark Hansen wasn't just a man, he was a symbol of unchecked power and corruption. Exposing him required more than evidence. It required precision, patience, and a strategic mind. Daniel's team had grown since his initial alliance with Jake and Sarah. The addition of Ethan, the whistleblower, had been a game changer. Reluctant at first, Ethan's growing confidence and moral drive had made him an indispensable part of their operation. He had access to the department's inner workings, providing real-time insights into Mark's activities. Their first victory came when Ethan managed to retrieve copies of internal police reports that showed Mark's repeated involvement in cases where evidence had mysteriously vanished or been tampered with. These reports were the smoking gun that proved Mark's manipulation of the justice system. But victories didn't come without setbacks. One evening, as Daniel was reviewing the latest intel, Jake called with grim news. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low. "Hansen's starting to sniff around. He's paranoid. Someone tipped him off that people are asking questions about him." Daniel's heart sank. "Do we know who?" "Not yet," Jake replied. "But he's tightening his circle. If we're not careful, he'll come after us before we're ready." This was the first real challenge they faced. Mark's paranoia made him unpredictable. He began taking extra precautions, shifting his routines and keeping a closer eye on those around him. For a moment, Daniel wondered if their plan would unravel before it even began. But then Sarah came through with a brilliant idea. "We need to make him feel invincible," she said during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "The more secure he feels, the more careless he'll become. Let him think he's untouchable. That's when he'll make mistakes." It was a risky move, but Daniel agreed. They began feeding small bits of false information through carefully chosen channels, creating the illusion that Mark's enemies were disorganized and weak. The strategy worked. Within weeks, Mark's confidence returned, and his arrogance grew. Mark's overconfidence became evident during a community fundraiser where he was a guest of honor. Daniel attended the event, not to confront him but to observe. He watched as Mark basked in the adoration of the crowd, his uniform gleaming, his smile wide. "He's drunk on his own power," Sarah whispered, standing beside Daniel. "That's his weakness." Mark's behavior at the event confirmed what they had suspected. He believed he was untouchable. But Daniel knew better. He wasn't there to gloat or to confront. He was there to study, to learn, and to solidify his resolve. As the weeks passed, Daniel's plan began to take shape. Each piece of evidence they uncovered was carefully cataloged and prepared for release. The goal wasn't just to expose Mark, it was to ensure that his fall was as public and humiliating as possible. The first step involved planting seeds of doubt within Mark's own department. Ethan began discreetly sharing bits of information with trusted colleagues, framing it as concerns about departmental integrity. The whispers grew, creating an undercurrent of suspicion that made it harder for Mark to maintain his iron grip. The second step was financial. Jake's investigation into Mark's illegal side business uncovered a series of offshore accounts that linked him to a network of criminal enterprises. With the help of a forensic accountant, they traced the money back to transactions that coincided with several high-profile cases. But then an unexpected complication arose. One evening, as Daniel was reviewing the final stages of their plan, he received a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering, his heart pounding. "Daniel Keller," the voice on the other end said, low and threatening. "You're playing a dangerous game." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" "You know exactly who I am," the voice replied. "Stay out of my business or you'll regret it." The line went dead, leaving Daniel gripping the phone with white-knuckled intensity. Mark knew. For a moment, Daniel felt the familiar pang of fear and self-doubt creeping back. But then he reminded himself of everything he had lost, everything he had endured. Mark might be dangerous, but he wasn't invincible. "This changes nothing," Daniel said aloud, his voice steady. When he told the team about the call, Jake's response was swift. "This just means we're getting close." He's scared. Let him make his threats. "It's a sign we're winning." Sarah agreed. If he's desperate enough to call you, he's desperate enough to make mistakes. We just need to stay ahead of him. The call served as a catalyst, solidifying Daniel's determination to see the plan through. The challenges they faced only strengthened his resolve. This wasn't just about revenge or justice anymore. It was about reclaiming his life, his power, and his dignity. The setup was nearly complete. The evidence was in place, the players were ready, and the stage was set. All that remained was the final act. The moment when Mark Hansen's carefully constructed empire would come crashing down. Daniel stared at the wall of evidence, his eyes scanning the faces, the dates, the connections. For the first time in months he felt a sense of clarity. Mark Hansen thought he was untouchable. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. The clock struck midnight, and Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the final pieces of his plan laid out before him. Every detail had been rehearsed, every contingency considered. The moment to strike had arrived. For months, Mark Hansen had been building his empire on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and power. Tonight, that empire would begin to crumble. The first move was strategic and quiet. Daniel and his team decided to attack Mark's financial dealings, an area that would expose his corruption in a way even the most skeptical observer couldn't ignore. With the help of their forensic accountant, they drafted an anonymous report detailing Mark's offshore accounts, complete with transaction logs and connections to organized crime. They sent the report to a trusted investigative journalist known for uncovering corruption within law enforcement. Within hours, the journalist published the damning article, complete with screenshots of the financial records. It was a bombshell. Social media exploded with outrage as the public demanded accountability from their trusted officers. Mark's carefully curated reputation began to show its first cracks. The first confrontation. The next morning, Mark stormed into the police department, his face flushed with fury. "Who's behind this?" he bellowed, slamming the newspaper onto the chief's desk. The chief, a stern man with graying hair, eyed the article. "This doesn't look good, Hansen," he said, his tone measured. "There are too many details here to ignore. We'll need to open an internal investigation." Mark scoffed. "Internal investigation? This is a smear campaign. Someone's trying to sabotage me." But as Mark left the office, his steps were less assured. For the first time he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Daniel watched the fallout from a distance, his heart pounding with adrenaline. The article was just the beginning. He had no intention of stopping until Mark was completely exposed. The anonymous tip. 2 days later, Daniel orchestrated his next move. Ethan, the whistleblower, secretly provided the department with information about Mark's tampering with evidence in high-profile cases. These were sent anonymously to the department's Internal Affairs Division. The evidence was too damning to ignore. The department announced a formal investigation into Mark Hansen's conduct, placing him on temporary leave. It was a public humiliation, but it only fueled Mark's desperation. Mark's descent. The cracks in Mark's facade began to widen. He tried to control the narrative, using his charm and connections to discredit the accusations. But with each move he exposed more of his vulnerabilities. The pressure mounted as colleagues began to distance themselves, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of his downfall. Behind the scenes, Daniel's team continued to dig. Sarah, the former officer, unearthed records of Mark's illicit dealings with local crime bosses. Jake coordinated with local activists to keep the public pressure alive. Protests outside the police department demanded justice, with signs that read, "No badge above the law." Mark's once unshakable confidence turned into paranoia. He doubled his security, constantly checked his surroundings, and lashed out at anyone who questioned him. The man who had once appeared untouchable was unraveling, piece by piece. The unexpected twist. But just as Daniel felt the momentum swinging entirely in his favor, a new complication arose. A man named Victor Morelli, one of the local crime bosses connected to Mark, contacted Daniel. Victor's message was clear: stay out of this or there will be consequences. Jake, ever the realist, was alarmed. This isn't just about Mark anymore. You're stepping on toes that belong to people who play by their own rules. Are you sure you're ready for this? Daniel hesitated for a moment but ultimately nodded. I didn't come this far to back down now. Victor's threat didn't deter Daniel, it emboldened him. If Mark was tied to organized crime, then bringing him down would dismantle a larger web of corruption. The final blow. The climax of Daniel's plan was set to unfold at the department's annual awards banquet, an event attended by top officials, community leaders, and the media. Mark, determined to prove his innocence, had insisted on attending despite his suspension. Unbeknownst to him, Daniel had arranged for a series of explosive revelations to be unveiled during the event. First, an anonymous whistleblower emailed the department's leadership a detailed report connecting Mark to missing evidence in several high-profile cases. The email included time-stamped photos of Mark tampering with evidence lockers, provided by Ethan. Then, Sarah used her insider connections to leak a video of Mark meeting with Victor Morelli. The footage, grainy but unmistakable, showed an exchange of cash in a dimly lit parking lot. As the banquet proceeded, attendees' phones began buzzing with notifications. The leaked materials spread like wildfire across social media. Reporters at the event scrambled to verify the information, their cameras turning toward Mark, who sat frozen at his table. When the chief of police took the stage, his face was grim. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we have recently been made aware of allegations of serious misconduct within our department. Rest assured, we will pursue this matter with the utmost diligence." All eyes turned to Mark, whose face was a mask of rage and panic. As the whispers grew louder, he abruptly stood and left the room, his once proud stride reduced to a hurried escape. A morally ambiguous choice. But Daniel wasn't finished. There was one last card to play, a recording Jake had uncovered of Mark threatening a witness in a prior case. The recording was damning, but its release came with risks. The witness, terrified of retaliation, had begged Daniel to withhold it. Daniel wrestled with the decision. Releasing the recording would all but guarantee Mark's downfall, but it could also put the witness in danger. In the end, Daniel chose to release it anonymously, taking measures to protect the witness's identity. It was a morally gray choice, one that weighed heavily on him. But as the recording spread, it cemented Mark's fate. Mark's fall. Within days, Mark Hansen's career was in ruins. He was arrested on charges of corruption, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. His former allies abandoned him, and the media vilified him as the symbol of everything wrong with the justice system. Daniel watched the news coverage from his living room, a mix of relief and exhaustion washing over him. The man who had destroyed his life was finally facing justice. But as he stared at the screen, he couldn't ignore the nagging question in the back of his mind: had he gone too far? The aftermath. Mark's fall sent shockwaves through the community, exposing a web of corruption that extended far beyond him. Several other officers and local officials were implicated, leading to widespread reforms within the department. For Daniel, the victory was bittersweet. He had achieved what he set out to do, but it had come at a cost. The moral compromises he had made along the way left him questioning whether justice had been worth the price. But as he stood in front of the mirror that night, looking at the man he had become, he realized one thing. He was no longer a victim. He had taken back his life, his dignity, and his power. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt free. The night was alive with an electric tension, the kind that made every breath feel heavier, every sound sharper. Daniel sat in his car outside the towering building hosting the police department's annual awards banquet. The event was a grand affair, filled with the city's elite, top officials, and members of the press. For Daniel, it was the perfect stage for the final act of his meticulously crafted plan. Mark Hansen, oblivious to the storm heading his way, was inside, wearing his trademark arrogance like a shield. Despite being suspended and under investigation, he had insisted on attending, determined to project an image of innocence and control. For years, Mark had operated with impunity, manipulating everyone around him. Tonight, Daniel would ensure that Mark's house of cards came crashing down. The final setup. As the banquet proceeded, Daniel's team worked behind the scenes to orchestrate the perfect exposé. Jake, Sarah, and Ethan were positioned in strategic locations, ready to trigger the cascade of events that would unveil Mark's corruption in real time. The plan was bold, but every detail had been considered. The first step was an anonymous text sent to all banquet attendees, journalists, officials, and even Mark himself. The message read: "The truth about Mark Hansen is about to be revealed. Stay tuned." Mark's phone buzzed just as he was engaging in conversation with a police chief and a local politician. His face darkened as he read the message, but he quickly masked his unease with a forced smile. "Everything all right, Hansen?" the chief asked, his tone neutral but probing. Of course, Mark replied smoothly, slipping his phone back into his pocket. Just some nonsense from a disgruntled nobody. But the confidence in his voice was starting to crack. The first blow. At precisely 8:30 p.m., Sarah sent the first bombshell to the local news outlets attending the event. A confidential report detailing Mark's tampering with evidence in multiple high-profile cases. The journalists were quick to verify the documents, their whispers and hurried phone calls creating ripples of tension across the room. Mark, noticing the shift in the room's atmosphere, began to grow visibly uneasy. His gaze darted around the banquet hall, landing on reporters huddled together, their faces lit by the glow of their phones. The murmurs grew louder as notifications buzzed across the attendees' phones. The media had gone live with the story, and within minutes, Mark's name was trending on social media, accompanied by headlines like, "Hero Cop" or "Master Manipulator?" Mark's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain seated, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. The public confrontation. The room fell silent as the chief of police took the stage. His expression was grim as he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, it has come to my attention that serious allegations have been made against one of our own. Rest assured, these claims will be thoroughly investigated." All eyes turned to Mark, whose face had turned a deep shade of red. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous," Mark bellowed, his voice cutting through the silence. "These accusations are baseless. Someone is trying to destroy my reputation." Daniel watched from the back of the room, his heart pounding. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment Mark's carefully constructed facade would collapse. The breaking point. As Mark attempted to defend himself, Sarah triggered the next phase of the plan, the release of a damning video showing Mark exchanging cash with Victor Morelli in a dimly lit parking lot. The video, accompanied by audio of their conversation, left no room for doubt about Mark's involvement in illegal activities. The room erupted in chaos. Journalists scrambled to break the news, their cameras now focused squarely on Mark. Officials whispered amongst themselves, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust. Mark's composure finally shattered. He stormed toward the stage, his finger pointed at the chief. "You're going to believe this garbage? After everything I've done for this department?" The chief, who had remained calm until now, stepped forward. "Sit down, Hanson," he said coldly. "You're only making this worse for yourself." But Mark wasn't done. He turned toward the crowd, his voice desperate and unhinged. "This is a setup. Someone's framing me." And then Daniel stepped forward. The face-off. The room fell silent as Daniel approached, his steps deliberate and unyielding. For months, he had dreamed of this moment, standing face to face with the man who had destroyed his life. "Framing you?" Daniel said, his voice steady but laced with contempt. "You framed yourself, Mark. Every lie, every manipulation, every crime, it's all catching up to you." Mark's eyes narrowed as he recognized Daniel. "You," he spat. "You think you're a hero? You're nothing but a bitter, broken man." Daniel stepped closer, his voice rising. "Maybe I was. But not anymore. You thought your badge made you untouchable, but it doesn't. The truth is out and there's no hiding from it." Mark's bravado faltered, his eyes darting around the room. The crowd was no longer on his side. He was alone, exposed and desperate. The shocking twist. As security escorted Mark off the stage, a final revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Jake had uncovered evidence linking Mark to a series of unsolved crimes, including a fatal hit-and-run involving a young woman. The woman, as it turned out, had been on her way to meet with internal affairs about Mark's misconduct. The revelation was the final nail in Mark's coffin. The crowd erupted in outrage, demanding justice not just for his corruption but for the lives he had destroyed. Poetic justice. Mark's downfall was swift and merciless. Within hours he was arrested and taken into custody. His face, once a symbol of authority, now adorned headlines as a disgraced officer. Daniel stood outside the banquet hall, the cool night air washing over him. He had won. Mark's flaws, his arrogance, greed and disregard for others, had been his undoing. But as Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him here, he couldn't ignore the moral ambiguity of his actions. He had crossed lines, made compromises, and embraced the darker parts of himself. Yet, despite the cost, he felt a sense of closure. Mark Hansen was finally where he belonged, behind bars, stripped of the power he had abused for so long. For Daniel, it wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming his life, his dignity, and his sense of justice. And as he walked away from the scene, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer defined by the betrayal that had broken him. He was free. The morning after the banquet was eerily quiet. The air felt different, as though the entire town was holding its breath, processing the shockwaves of the previous night's revelations. Mark Hansen's name was plastered across every major news outlet, his face no longer that of a respected officer but of a disgraced criminal. For Daniel, the victory was bittersweet. The battle was over, but the scars it left behind ran deep. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee as the news played in the background. The anchor's voice was calm but firm as she recounted Mark's crimes. Corruption, evidence tampering, ties to organized crime, and his involvement in a hit-and-run that had ended an innocent life. The headlines felt surreal, like the climax of a movie Daniel had somehow become the protagonist of. His phone buzzed with messages, some from friends congratulating him, others from curious acquaintances seeking details. But Daniel ignored them all, lost in his thoughts. The weight of what he had done, the lengths he had gone to, and the moral lines he had crossed loomed large in his mind. Mark's fall. Mark's arrest was only the beginning of his downfall. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and with the media's relentless scrutiny, there was no escaping the public's fury. His allies deserted him, unwilling to risk their own reputations. The department suspended him indefinitely, and he faced a slew of criminal charges that would undoubtedly lead to prison time. For Mark, the worst blow wasn't the loss of his career or freedom, it was the humiliation. The man who had once wielded power with impunity now found himself powerless, reduced to a cautionary tale. In a rare interview from jail, Mark attempted to portray himself as a victim, claiming he had been targeted by bitter enemies, but his words rang hollow. The evidence was too damning, and the public's sympathy was non-existent. The team's closure. Daniel's team, Jake, Sarah, and Ethan, gathered at his home a week after the banquet. The atmosphere was subdued, a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," Sarah said, raising a glass. "We took him down." Ethan, who had been quiet for most of the evening, finally spoke. "I never thought I'd see the day. I still can't believe it's over." Jake leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's over for him, sure. But for us? It's just the beginning. What we did here, it mattered. And it showed that people like Mark can be held accountable." The conversation shifted to lighter topics, but Daniel remained introspective. He appreciated their camaraderie, but he couldn't shake the feeling that his victory had come at a price. Emma's regret. 2 weeks after Mark's arrest, Daniel received an unexpected visitor, Emma. She stood on his doorstep, her face pale and drawn. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel hesitated but eventually nodded, stepping aside to let her in. They sat in the living room, the silence between them heavy. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," Emma began, tears brimming in her eyes. "For everything. For what I did to you, for believing Mark's lies, for—" Her voice broke. Daniel listened, his expression unreadable. He had waited for this moment, imagined it countless times. But now that it was here, he felt no satisfaction, only a hollow ache. "I can't undo what's been done," she continued. "But I want you to know that I regret everything. I let myself be manipulated, and I lost the one person who truly cared about me." Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "I appreciate your apology, Emma. But this isn't about us anymore. What's done is done. I've moved on." She nodded, wiping her tears. "I understand. I needed you to know." As Emma left, Daniel felt a strange sense of closure. Her apology didn't erase the pain, but it allowed him to finally let go of the anger he had carried for so long. The community's reaction. The town, once divided on Mark's character, was now united in its condemnation. Protests erupted, demanding systemic reform within the police department. Mark's downfall exposed not just his corruption but the complicity of those who had turned a blind eye to his actions. The department announced sweeping changes, including increased oversight and stricter accountability measures. For the first time in years, the community felt a glimmer of hope. Daniel received numerous messages from people thanking him for his courage. Some shared their own stories of injustice, inspired by his determination to fight back. While he didn't see himself as a hero, their words reminded him that his actions had made a difference. Daniel's reflection. Late one evening, Daniel sat in his study, staring at the journal Emma had left behind. It was the catalyst that had set everything in motion, the reminder of the pain and betrayal that had nearly destroyed him. But as he turned the pages, he felt something shift within him. The journal no longer represented his heartbreak. It symbolized his resilience, his ability to rise from the ashes. He thought about the choices he had made, the lines he had crossed, and the person he had become. The journey had changed him, hardened him in ways he hadn't anticipated. But it had also taught him the value of standing up for himself, of refusing to be a victim. For the first time in months, Daniel allowed himself to breathe, to truly let go. The storm had passed, and he was ready to move forward. A new chapter. The following morning, Daniel met with a local nonprofit organization dedicated to helping victims of corruption and abuse of power. Inspired by his journey, he decided to use his skills and experiences to make a difference. As he left the meeting, the weight that had burdened him for so long felt lighter. The scars of his past would always remain, but they no longer defined him. Walking down the bustling street, Daniel smiled for the first time in what felt like forever. He had faced the darkness, confronted his demons, and emerged stronger. His story wasn't just about revenge, it was about redemption, about finding the courage to rebuild. And as he looked ahead, he knew that his best days were still to come. The soft hum of the city at dusk served as a backdrop to Daniel's thoughts as he sat by his window, gazing at the horizon. The evening sky was painted in shades of amber and crimson, the fading sun a stark contrast to the storm that had raged within him over the past months. The world outside seemed calm, but inside, Daniel's mind churned with questions and realizations, his journey far from over in his heart. Mark Hansen was in prison, disgraced and stripped of his power. Justice had been served, or had it? That was the question Daniel couldn't stop asking himself. Victory should have felt triumphant, but instead, it felt complicated. The man staring back at him in the window's reflection wasn't the same person who had started this journey. The weight of choices. Daniel leaned back, his chair creaking under the weight of his thoughts. The steps he had taken to bring Mark down had been necessary, of that he was certain. But necessity didn't always absolve morality. He had crossed lines he never thought he would, made choices that blurred the boundary between right and wrong. He thought about the whistleblower who had hesitated to come forward, fearful of Mark's retaliation. Daniel had promised protection, but the release of that recording, while anonymized, still gnawed at him. Had he done enough to ensure their safety? Or had his desperation to win overshadowed their fear? Then there was the witness whose testimony had tied Mark to the hit and run. They too had been caught in the crossfire of his vendetta. Was it fair to put others in harm's way for the sake of justice? Or had he justified it all too easily because the ends aligned with his goals? The cost of revenge. Daniel's mind drifted to Emma. Her betrayal had shattered him, setting this entire journey into motion. But her regret had been genuine, her apology sincere. In her eyes, he had seen the weight of her mistakes, a reflection of the burdens he now carried. He wondered if, in some way, he had become like her, driven by emotion, blinded by the need to fill a void. Emma's actions had cost her their marriage, their shared dreams, and her sense of self. Daniel's actions, while justifiable in many ways, had cost him something too. Had revenge filled the void Emma and Mark had left behind? Or had it merely deepened it, creating new questions and conflicts within him? Resilience and growth. But even amidst the doubts, Daniel couldn't deny the growth he had experienced. He was no longer the man who had been crushed by betrayal, paralyzed by humiliation. That version of him had been stripped away, replaced by someone stronger, someone who had learned to stand up not just for himself but for others. He thought about the community's reaction. The protests, the calls for reform, the changes already being implemented within the police department. People were talking about justice in a way they hadn't before. And Daniel had been the catalyst for that change. That realization brought him a measure of peace. His pain, his sacrifices hadn't been in vain. If his actions had inspired even one person to fight for what was right, then perhaps the lines he had crossed were worth it. The lessons learned. Daniel reached for Emma's journal, the one that had ignited the spark of his revenge. He flipped through the pages, the words now carrying a different weight. The journal had once symbolized his heartbreak, the betrayal that had unraveled his life. But now it represented something else: resilience, transformation, and the power of taking control. The lessons from his journey were etched into his soul. Power corrupts, but it can also be challenged. Mark's downfall was proof that no one was untouchable. Corruption could be dismantled when met with determination and courage. Justice is never simple. The road to justice was fraught with moral ambiguity. It wasn't always about right versus wrong. It was about navigating the gray areas with as much integrity as possible. Healing takes time. Daniel's scars, both visible and invisible, would remain. But scars weren't just reminders of pain. They were proof of survival, of growth, of the strength to endure. The path ahead. As the stars began to dot the night sky, Daniel felt a strange sense of clarity. His story wasn't just about revenge. It was about rediscovery. He had lost so much: his marriage, his sense of security, his faith in others. But he had gained something too: a deeper understanding of himself, his values, and his capacity for resilience. The future was still uncertain, but Daniel was no longer afraid of uncertainty. The battle with Mark had shown him that he could face the worst life had to offer and come out the other side. The thought of using his experiences to help others brought him a sense of purpose. The nonprofit organization he had met with was only the beginning. He wanted to ensure that no one else would have to face the kind of betrayal and corruption he had endured alone. An open ending. As Daniel closed the journal and placed it back on the shelf, he allowed himself a rare smile. His journey had been painful, messy, and fraught with difficult choices. But it had also been transformative. And while his story wasn't neatly wrapped up with a bow, that was okay. Life, he realized, was never about perfection or absolutes. It was about finding meaning in the chaos, growth in the pain, and strength in the face of adversity. The reflection in the window now showed a man at peace, not because his life was perfect, but because he had fought to reclaim it. Daniel turned off the light and headed to bed, leaving the night behind. Tomorrow was a new day, and for the first time in a long time he looked forward to it. The years that followed Mark Hansen's fall were marked by transformation, not just for Daniel, but for the community and the people whose lives had intersected with his. The legacy of Daniel's actions rippled outward, reaching far beyond his own life. While the journey had been fraught with moral ambiguity and personal sacrifice, it left a profound and lasting impact. A community transformed. The reforms sparked by Mark's exposure were sweeping. The police department underwent a complete overhaul, with independent oversight committees established to ensure accountability. Officers who had been complicit in Mark's schemes were dismissed or faced charges of their own. Trust in the justice system, though slow to rebuild, began to mend as the community saw tangible changes. The hit-and-run case tied to Mark gained national attention, becoming a rallying cry for victims of corruption. The young woman's family, once silenced by fear, found solace in seeing justice served. They became outspoken advocates for transparency in law enforcement, their voices amplified by a growing movement. Protests that had once been fueled by anger evolved into forums for constructive dialogue. Community leaders worked with law enforcement to address systemic issues, focusing on education, outreach, and training. Daniel watched from a distance, his role in the movement unspoken but deeply felt. Mark Hansen's enduring consequences. For Mark, the fall was absolute. Stripped of his badge, reputation, and allies, he faced trial after trial, each one peeling back another layer of his corruption. The charges against him ranged from bribery and extortion to conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The evidence Daniel and his team had uncovered was airtight, leaving Mark with no room to maneuver. The courtroom became the stage for Mark's ultimate reckoning. Witnesses testified about his manipulation and intimidation, painting a portrait of a man who had wielded power as a weapon. Among them was Ethan, who found the courage to share his story publicly. His testimony was a turning point in the trial, exposing the full extent of Mark's deceit. Mark was sentenced to multiple decades in prison, his appeals denied at every turn. In the sterile confines of his cell, he was no longer the powerful officer who had once commanded fear and respect. He was just another criminal, left to confront the legacy of his actions in solitude. Daniel's new path. For Daniel, life after the storm was about rebuilding, not just his own life but the lives of others. He became deeply involved with the nonprofit organization he had met with, using his story to inspire and empower those who had faced similar betrayals. His work ranged from mentoring victims of corruption to advocating for policy changes at the state level. He also found a new sense of fulfillment in sharing his experiences publicly. At first, it was difficult to revisit the pain and humiliation of his journey, but as he spoke at community centers, universities, and conferences, he saw the impact his story had on others. People approached him after his talks, sharing their own struggles and thanking him for giving them hope. One woman, a mother of 3 who had been the victim of workplace harassment, told him, "Hearing you fight back gave me the courage to stand up for myself. You reminded me that we don't have to let people like Mark win. Those moments made every sacrifice feel worth it." Emma's journey. Emma too had been shaped by the events. After her apology to Daniel, she began a journey of self-reflection. The choices she had made, the lies she had believed, and the consequences of her actions weighed heavily on her. But rather than wallow in guilt, she chose to grow. She moved to a new city, where she enrolled in counseling courses, determined to help others avoid the pitfalls that had ensnared her. Over time, she and Daniel reconnected, not as lovers but as individuals who had shared a difficult chapter of their lives. Their conversations were brief but cordial, and for both they provided a sense of closure. Legacy of resilience. Daniel's personal life also began to flourish. The pain of betrayal had once made him wary of trust, but as he healed, he opened himself to the possibility of love again. He met someone who admired his strength but didn't shy away from his scars. Their relationship, built on mutual respect and understanding, was a testament to his growth. At home, Daniel kept a small box on a shelf in his study. Inside were mementos of his journey: Emma's journal, a copy of the article that had exposed Mark, and a photo of the team that had stood by him. It wasn't a shrine to his pain but a reminder of his resilience. A catalyst for change. Daniel's story became a symbol of resistance against corruption, inspiring others to challenge injustices in their own lives. The reforms his actions sparked served as a blueprint for other communities facing similar issues. His name was rarely mentioned in the headlines, but he didn't mind. For him, the real reward was knowing that change had taken root. He continued to mentor others, often reminding them, "It's not about the battle you fight, it's about who you become because of it. The scars you carry aren't just reminders of pain, they're proof of your strength." The enduring ripple. The legacy Daniel left behind wasn't about the destruction of Mark Hansen. It was about the rebuilding that followed. It was about the courage of people like Ethan, the resilience of the community, and the hope that change was possible. As Daniel stood on the steps of the nonprofit's new building, watching volunteers gather for another day of work, he felt a deep sense of peace. The pain of his past hadn't vanished, but it had transformed into something meaningful. His story wasn't just his own anymore. It belonged to everyone who had found strength in it, everyone who had dared to fight back. And that, Daniel realized, was the greatest legacy of all. The distant sound of waves crashing against the shore carried a soothing rhythm, like a metronome for the memories swirling in Daniel's mind. He strolled barefoot along the wet sand, feeling the cool, grainy texture underfoot. The salty air mixed with the earthy aroma of seaweed and driftwood, and the ocean breeze tugged gently at his loose linen shirt. Above him, the sun hung low, casting the world in a golden glow as it began its slow descent toward the horizon. It had been 10 years since the night that changed his life forever, the night Mark Hansen's empire of lies collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. A decade felt like both a lifetime and the blink of an eye. Time had softened the jagged edges of those memories, yet their significance had only grown, each one a cornerstone of the person Daniel had become. He paused, letting the cold surf wash over his feet. The water's ebb and flow mirrored the rhythm of his life, the struggles that pulled him under, the triumphs that lifted him back to shore. He reflected on how much he had changed. A life reimagined. Daniel was now in his mid-40s, his once dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. The physical reminders of time didn't bother him. If anything, they felt earned, a testament to the battles he had fought and survived. His life looked nothing like it had 10 years ago, but that was by design. The cutthroat world of real estate, once his entire identity, was now a distant memory. In its place was a quieter, more purposeful life. The nonprofit organization he had founded, Justice Restored, had started as a small initiative to help victims of corruption navigate the legal system. Over the years, it had grown into a national force, a movement that gave voice to the silenced and held the powerful accountable. Daniel often found himself humbled by the stories that crossed his desk. Ordinary people facing extraordinary injustice. They came from every corner of society. Whistleblowers exposing corporate misconduct, families fighting for justice after losing loved ones, and communities grappling with systemic corruption. Each story reminded him of why he had started this journey in the first place. Mark Hansen's ultimate fate. Some names, however, faded over time. Mark Hansen's was one of them. Mark was still alive, though only just. He was serving multiple sentences in a federal prison, far from the life of power and influence he had once wielded. Daniel had heard snippets about him over the years, how he spent his days in isolation, estranged from the world he had once controlled. In his early years of incarceration, Mark had tried to maintain his arrogance, insisting he'd been framed. But as the years wore on and the appeals dried up, reality set in. The system he had manipulated so effectively now held him in its unrelenting grip. Daniel felt no satisfaction in Mark's misery. That part of him, the part that had once burned with vengeance, had been quieted. He didn't need Mark to suffer for him to move on. The man's downfall had been inevitable, a direct consequence of his greed, hubris, and cruelty. The ripple effects. As Daniel resumed walking, he thought about the ripple effects of Mark's exposure. The reforms within the police department had been only the beginning. Across the country, Justice Restored had partnered with local organizations to advocate for greater accountability in law enforcement, politics, and corporate governance. The changes in his own community had been profound. The police department, once synonymous with corruption, was now a model of transparency. Officers received better training, oversight committees ensured accountability, and trust between law enforcement and the public had been restored. The most fulfilling part for Daniel was seeing the people he had worked with flourish. Ethan, once terrified of speaking out, had become one of the nonprofit's regional directors, mentoring others who had been silenced by fear. Sarah, the former officer who had risked everything to expose Mark, was now a consultant helping reform other departments across the country. Jake, ever the skeptic, had finally retired but remained a sounding board for Daniel, occasionally ribbing him about going soft. Family and fulfillment. As Daniel walked further along the shore, he thought of his family waiting for him back at their beach house. He had remarried 5 years ago to a woman named Clara. Clara had been a civil rights attorney when they met, and her passion for justice had matched his own. She was kind, patient, and fiercely intelligent. A partner who understood the weight of his past without trying to erase it. Clara had a daughter from a previous marriage, a precocious teenager named Lily, who had become one of the great joys of Daniel's life. They had bonded over shared interests, books, hiking, and a mutual disdain for overly cheesy movies. Being part of their family had brought a sense of warmth and wholeness that Daniel hadn't realized he was missing. Every evening spent laughing around the dinner table, every quiet morning sipping coffee on the porch, reminded him that life after pain wasn't just possible, it could be beautiful. Legacy of hope. Daniel's nonprofit had grown far beyond his initial dreams. It wasn't just an organization, it was a beacon for people seeking justice in a world that often seemed indifferent. Stories of victories filled their newsletters, laws changed, wrongs righted, lives rebuilt. He often spoke at events, sharing his journey not as a cautionary tale but as a testament to resilience. We don't choose the storms that come into our lives, he often said, but we do choose how we navigate them. And sometimes, the hardest paths lead us to the most meaningful destinations. A poignant reflection. The sun had dipped lower, turning the sky into a canvas of deep orange, fiery red, and muted purple. Daniel stopped walking, letting the surf wash over his feet as he gazed at the horizon. 10 years ago, he had been a broken man, his life shattered by betrayal. But he had rebuilt it, piece by painstaking piece. His journey had been messy, complicated, and full of moral ambiguity. Yet it had also been transformative. The waves whispered their timeless rhythm, a reminder that life was never static. It ebbed and flowed, pulling some things away while bringing others closer. Daniel smiled, the weight of his past no longer a burden but a foundation. His story wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about hope, growth, and the strength to turn pain into purpose. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Daniel turned back toward the house, ready to embrace whatever tomorrow would bring. What would you do if your world was torn apart by betrayal? Would you let it define you, or would you find the strength to rise above it? Daniel's story is a powerful reminder that even in the darkest moments, resilience and determination can lead to profound transformation. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. How far would you go to seek justice, and what would you sacrifice to rebuild your life? If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for more bold, mature stories that dive deep into the complexities of human nature. And before you go, make sure to check out our next video, where we unravel another gripping tale of betrayal, power, and redemption. Your journey begins with a single click. Join us for more stories that leave you questioning everything you thought you knew.